Okay, hello everybody. So we'll just wait a few more seconds as we let everybody in. Welcome. We will get started in 30 seconds. All right, it looks like people have joined us. We'll get started and people will come in as they come in. Welcome, everybody. I'm thrilled to have you all here for the Graduate Student Knowledge Bases webinar. Everything starts from your house, Assyrian American Women's Perspectives on Identity, Heritage, and Motherwork. This webinar highlights research on the perspectives and experiences of Assyrian women, particularly focusing on mothers who share their unique experiences as immigrants in the United States. Before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce those to the Graduate Student Knowledge Base. It is an initiative created by the Assyrian Studies Association that was designed with a clear mission to be a beacon of support and guidance for graduate students. From mastering research methodologies to navigating the ups and downs of academic life, this platform is here to foster collaboration, provide essential tips, and help grad students thrive in their academic careers. Today's webinar is designed to connect you with current research that highlights Assyrians in a positive light and fosters active dialogue with the scholar behind the study. Our goal is to also introduce you to innovative research methodologies that can inspire your own work. Altogether, we hope to encourage and empower you to contribute to Assyrian research. If you take inspiration from today's webinar and would like to be part of future events, either in person or online, please visit our website, graduatestudenttknowledgebase.com/contact to submit your inquiry. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions throughout this presentation. After the presentation, we'll have a dedicated Q&A session where we will address your questions. In addition, this webinar is recorded and will be available on both Assyrian Studies Association and Graduate Student Knowledge Base's website, in addition to our YouTube page. If you are interested to stay up to date about future events, both online and in person, make sure to sign up on both of our websites. If you are a graduate student, make sure to become a member of the Graduate Student Knowledge Base to keep track of all available events, grants, and much more. It's free to register and is filled with resources meant to help you along your academic journey. Now let's move on with today's program. I'm honored to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Paige Peterson. Paige is a Turlock native passionate about multilingualism, language access, and supporting immigrant and refugee communities. She holds a Master's of Arts in Education with a specialization in Applied Linguistics from San Francisco State University, along with a Bachelor's of Arts in both Linguistics and Sociology from UC Santa Barbara. Her research interests center on sociolinguistics and applied linguistics, particularly with how gender and language intersect. Wanting to help bridge the gap in academic literature on Assyrian diaspora, Paige focused her master's thesis on documenting Assyrian narratives. Her work, which is the same title of this webinar, Everything Starts from Your House, Assyrian American Women's Perspectives on Identity, Heritage, and Motherwork, highlights the experiences of 6 Assyrian American women who immigrated as adults from Iran. Her research underscores the vital, multifaceted, and often unequal roles Assyrian women play in preserving the Assyrian language, heritage, and identity. Today, we are not only fortunate to hear about her research, but also gain a glimpse into the unique perspectives she discovered after interviewing these 6 amazing Assyrian American women. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Paige Peterson. We're grateful to have you today.
Thank you, Alexandra, for introducing me, and thank you to the Assyrian Studies Association for giving me the opportunity to speak today and share a little about my work. I also want to thank everyone being here today. I know it's a Sunday, and so I'm very grateful for all of you taking an hour out of your weekend just to hear about this research. And yeah, like Alexandra mentioned, my thesis was titled Everything Starts from Your House, Assyrian American Women's Perspectives on Identity, Heritage, and Motherwork. And so for my thesis, I got to work with 6 amazing Assyrian American women, and one of their something one of the women mentioned that I felt really captured what this research was about was نكبة سوري رابا زعمت كرشانة هلاخينا بينت كلباتينا بينت خيوتاينا, which means Assyrian women are hard workers, they are lovers of family, they are lovers of life. If you have Assyrian women in your life, you probably already know this is undeniably true. However, this hard work and this love that Assyrian women have often goes unnoticed or at the very least unappreciated. And so really the goal for this work was just to better understand and recognize all that Assyrian moms do and contribute to their communities. Okay. And so I'm going to get into kind of some background for this work. So again, my name is Paige. I'm from Turlock, California. My research interests and life goals kind of center around supporting multilingualism, language access, and immigrant and refugee communities. I think these interests are rooted in my own experiences as a kid. I attended adult immersion elementary school where I grew up being taught in both Spanish and English. And I was in a space that really valued multilingualism. And most of my peers came from immigrant backgrounds. And I grew up wanting to better support multilingual education and the communities I grew up surrounded by. I decided in college to double major in linguistics and sociology. And this is when I first started learning more about the Assyrian diaspora and getting to do academic research with people in the Assyrian community. And then 3 years after I started my undergrad, I started my graduate school. And it was here that I decided to pursue my master's in education and knew that I wanted to continue doing research with the Assyrian community. And so I decided for my thesis, I was going to focus on the perspectives of one of the groups within the community, which I felt was most underserved, especially in academic research, which was the Assyrian women who immigrated as adults. And so, with that, despite their history of survival and resilience, Assyrian voices, particularly those of Assyrian women, are severely underrepresented in academic research. Though these interviews with Through these interviews with 6 Assyrian American women, this study aimed to serve as a platform to document these voices. So with that, the purpose was one, to better understand the experiences of Assyrian American women across social, linguistic, cultural, and gendered domains, and also to bridge gaps in several areas of academic research and literature. And these gaps included specifically the underrepresentation of Assyrian voices and narratives in academia, but also more broadly, they included the underrepresentation of Middle Eastern voices in academia, particularly for Middle Eastern women and minorities. Okay, and so in terms of the methodology for my work, I had one research question, and it was, what are the sociolinguistic experiences of immigrant Assyrian women, and how do these experiences shape their identity? This question was really broad, and so I knew I wanted to have a more focused approach, and so I developed 3 goals going into this work. The first was to explore the social, linguistic, cultural, and gendered experiences of Assyrian women. The second was to explore how Assyrian mothers pass language and heritage on to their children. And the third was to explore the challenges affecting Assyrian women across multiple spheres. And so there are 2 terms I'm going to use today that I'd like to define. The first is motherwork, and this will be said a lot. Basically, motherwork is all of the labor taken on by mothers on behalf of their children and or their communities, most of which goes unnoticed. For minority women, especially linguistic minority women like Assyrians, this mother work also includes their efforts to pass their language and heritage onto their children. And the second term is ethnography or ethnographic research, which is a style of research that explores people's everyday experiences and cultures through in-depth personal engagement. I chose an ethnographic style because I aim to learn as well as to document. So it was important to me that in my research design, I was just as much a listener as I was a researcher. And so for my participants, there were 6 participants in my research. All 6 were women, adults when they immigrated, able to speak Assyrian, and mothers. But the women varied in age, profession, educational background, the number of years they had been in the US, their age at immigration, and the languages in which they spoke. Also, although not required, all 6 were married from Iran and living in Turlock. These were more coincidental than active choices I made in my participant selection. Although Assyrians are a diasporic group and live all over the world, the Assyrians of Turlock are mostly from Iran. But there was a variation in which part of Iran the women I selected came from, and this stretched from the capital city of Tehran to smaller villages outside Urmi. And then in regards to confidentiality, in my research, I used pseudonyms for all but one woman who strongly preferred I use her real name. And so today, very little, if any, demographic information will be used when I discuss the research, again, to maintain this confidentiality. And so the names you see today, except for one, are pseudonyms. Okay, and then for my research, I opted to use purposive sampling instead of random sampling, which basically means that I selected participants based on if they met the selection criteria, but differed from participants in other characteristics. Um, I also felt that given the sensitivity of this research, rather than collect a random sample, it would be more ethical to work with women I already knew. All 6 women were supportive of and open to participating in this research. Because the women knew me, they also knew that despite not being Assyrian myself, I was familiar with and immersed in the Assyrian culture and language. This familiarity, in addition to the fact that I was a woman researching women, was really important. It definitely created a more comfortable environment for women to share their perspectives on topics like immigration and assimilation and gender inequality. And it was also important to me that I included participants from a range of linguistic backgrounds. And so I was fortunate enough to have help from 2 Assyrian individuals, Kevin Agassi Lelham and Sarah Shalbazian. Having research assistants who were fluent in Assyrian was really important to me as it allowed me to include women that I would otherwise not have been able to. Kevin translated the entire interview guide, and both Kevin and Sarah interpreted, translated, and transcribed the interviews that were conducted in Assyrian. Huge shout out to them. They were instrumental in this research and made it so much more inclusive. And so for my data collection, I used ethnographic semi-structured interviews, which is basically having several areas of interest like immigration and education, but really open-ended questions for them. I really wanted the women to do most of the talking and just sharing their experiences rather than having a super long list of questions to ask. Our interviews mainly took form in the format of Jaikava, which, if you're not familiar with the term, is basically a small gathering between meals in which Assyrians come together to drink tea and coffee and eat sweets. Each interview lasted 1 to 3 hours, and this amounted to over 10 hours of data. For the data analysis, this allowed me, sorry, for the data analysis, I first transcribed each interview by hand. If it was in Assyrian, sorry, transcribed each interview. If it was in Assyrian, by hand. If it was in English, it was through using Trint, which is a transcription software. Again, this is where Kevin and Sarah were a huge help in that they were doing the transcriptions by hand, first translating, then transcribing. And then second, I performed multiple readings of each transcript once they were all done using grounded theory and the constant comparative method. These allowed me to get a broader idea of the similarities and differences across the interviews. Third, I then used open coding to identify and label segments of data relevant to the different strengths, struggles, and just overall experiences shaping the women's identities. And as I coded the data, I continuously compared both within and across interviews, taking note of how each new piece of data related to previously coded segments. Um, Considering where each woman's insights shared similarities and differences with others' perspectives helped me identify recurring themes, patterns, and variations. And then fourth, throughout this all, I performed memoing, which is just documenting all your reflections and questions. And this helped me make connections between each transcript. And I also made connections in performing thematic analysis of all the texts. Each step in the data analysis really was focused on helping me identify, again, recurring themes, patterns, and just variations in the data. And so the 6 interviews amounted to over 10 hours of storytelling, heartfelt reflections, and just a deeper perspective on Assyrian women's realities. What the women shared in their interviews reflected a dynamic interplay of motherwork, survival, and resilience, and individual agency. While each narrative was unique in that it was reflective of each woman's lived experience, there were 4 main themes that arose across the interviews, and we're going to talk about each 4. So the first finding was that across the diaspora, Assyrian women find empowerment, pride, and resistance in motherwork. I have 3 quotes that I pulled from this section of my thesis that I feel highlight that empowerment, pride, and resistance. And so, first, I'm going to talk about the empowerment the women described finding in their mother work. The first quote is, "I never wanted my same path to be my daughter's. I wanted my daughter to excel because I myself wasn't. I wanted her to excel." Michelle was one of the 2 women with the least formal education. Both of those women shared how they wished they had been able to go to school and how they channeled this yearning for education into supporting their children, particularly their daughters, in their schooling and academic lives. The other woman said that what she enjoys most about life in the US is that her kids are educated, and she shared stories about staying up with her daughter until 1 o'clock in the morning, providing her companionship and support as she studied. And a lot of the women described how empowering it felt to be able to provide opportunities to their kids that they themselves did not have. The women also felt a lot of empowerment just in supporting their kids with these opportunities, staying up late with them, driving them to a Syrian school, and really pushing their kids to be successful. The women also described feeling a sense of pride in their mother work. For example, during Katie's interview, when the topic came up of how Assyrian women could be better supported in passing on their heritage, rather than list external factors like better resources or greater support from the community, she focused on the importance of strong, intentional mother work. And she said, just keep talking Assyrian to your kids. That's my message. As a woman, you just need to follow that rule in your house. Starts from your house. Everything starts from your house. If your child is mannered or not mannered, succeeds in life or does not succeed in life, is a gentleman or not a gentleman, or a lady or not a lady, these are all coming from home, from the mom. And so motherwork also served as a form of resistance for many of the women. All 6 women described passing Assyrian on in the United States as more challenging than passing it on in Iran, and pointed to the reason for this being that in Iran, Assyrian parents were strictly against Farsi being spoken in the home. And so for this one, we have 2 quotes, one from Lana, who shared that we always spoke Assyrian in the house, Farsi outside, inside only our language. And Betty, who shared, because I guess back then our parents or the whole community of Assyrians were more strict because we were a minority. Assyrian Christian, Assyrian in Iran, and the rest were Muslims. So our parents were trying to hold us back from them, to not get involved with them. They didn't want us to get married with them, get too involved with them. That's why they were trying to hold us back from them, you know? And so in Lana's interview, she described that for many, speaking Assyrian was a form of resistance and a direct response to how they were treated in Iran. Lana described instances in which her and her mom were at the market and were called najis, which basically means unclean and untouchable, and were told that they would not be allowed to touch anything in the shop. And so Lana and other women described that it was this kind of treatment and othering that really fueled Assyrian families to strictly avoid speaking Farsi in the house. For the women, who are mostly the ones at home passing on the Assyrian language, choosing not to speak Farsi around their children was their way of resisting this treatment. And that brings us to our second point, in that despite finding empowerment, pride, and resistance in their mother work, there was a consensus that there is a huge weight placed on the shoulders of Assyrian women to ensure the survival of the Assyrian identity. And so, in response to, for who do you think it was more important for their kids to go to Assyrian school, the mother or father? Ashley responded, well, at that time, fathers would just work, they wouldn't be home. Mothers were there saying, because it is a Muslim country, for them to be among Assyrians, be there, study, find someone that is Assyrian, not get lost among outsiders. And so when the topic of who was responsible for passing on the Assyrian language and culture came up, five of the women believed that Assyrian parents shared equal responsibility, while one felt that it fell on whoever knew the language better. All six women felt, though, that despite that the responsibility should fall equally on both parents, Assyrian mothers tended to take on most of this labor. All of the women shared similar explanations for this, the recurring theme being that because fathers were out working long hours, and since mothers were usually the parent at home, they tended to take on most of this labor. And so perhaps with that, the argument can be made that this distribution of labor weighed equally on both parents, where fathers provided for the family, while mothers were homemakers who taught their kids Assyrian. However, many of the women describe the incredible weight that is added when the mother is working outside the home as well, as many Assyrian women are within the US. The women's narratives highlighted that the employed Assyrian mom, in addition to working all day, must ensure that she not only finds the time and has the energy to take care of her home and family, but also to support her child in learning Assyrian, as Lana describes here. So when asked, do you think that the effort is more done by the Assyrian women in the community? Lana shared, yeah, Assyrian women, because men, no, I don't think even one time my husband took my child to Assyrian school. Mostly because men are always working. So when they come home, they're tired. And so of course, our job is more relaxing, so we have more time. To which we responded, but you work a lot too. And Lana shared, but still, I've always been out working, so I'm used to it. I never get tired. Let's say, okay, I come home, take them to Assyrian school, come back, and then go there. And then, it's just, I'm more motivated. To many Assyrian women like Lana, motherhood is tied both to the economic and the domestic spheres. So here we see that the working mom must work to provide for her family, but still fulfill the obligations of a stay-at-home mom. And so, like many other immigrant mothers, Assyrian moms feel this heavy responsibility to actively make the effort and find time to pass on their heritage and language, even if they're also taking on substantially more work outside the home. And outside of linguistic mother work, the linguistic mother work expected of Assyrian mothers, four of the women also shared that Assyrian women face a much greater pressure to marry someone Assyrian than Assyrian men do. Lana and Katie, two of the four who made this point, explained that pressuring young Assyrians to marry within the community is done to ensure the survival of the Assyrian identity. However, Lana described that if Assyrian men dated or married outside their community, his parents and community would likely still accept him. She attributed this to the mentality that men are the roots of the family, and then shared that for Assyrian girls who marry a non-Assyrian, though, many face being disowned or let go from their families and their community. Describing this pressure, Lana shared, still, there's this idea that we have to marry from our own culture. We have to date or marry someone from our culture to keep our language. I should marry an Assyrian to speak Assyrian, and so my family will speak Assyrian together. We pressure our girls to only marry an Assyrian, or they pressure themselves because they think my mom wants me to marry Assyrian, even though I'm not happy, I have to marry an Assyrian boy. And so for many of this women, this sorry, one second. This leads us into the third finding, which is that Assyrian women are often forced to choose between fulfilling their own desires or meeting the needs of their families and communities. Um, Three of the women expressed that while they themselves did not want to immigrate to the US, comfortable with their lives in Iran, they did so for familial reasons, such as to reunite with loved ones abroad or because their families back home pushed them to. Here, Michelle describes this, sharing in response to why did you want to come to America? You specifically sharing, had I not been married, I wouldn't even have come to America. Maybe I would have never came to America. I came to America because I couldn't separate from my husband. It made me really depressed. I then followed up and asked why she didn't tell her husband that she wanted to stay in Iran rather than immigrate, to which Michelle responded, no, well, I said, okay, let's go. I said, I can't leave my husband by himself. I said, let's go build our life there so that our children can succeed there. Michelle's priorities centered around the needs of her husband and her children, evident in that her immigration to the US was not fueled by her own desire, but rather her aim to support her husband and set her children up for success. And apart from immigration, education was also mentioned as a point of tension when it came to choosing between fulfilling one's own aspirations or the needs of one's family or community. Nana Jan, along with the other girls in her town, was not allowed to attend school out of the fear that there she would meet and end up marrying someone who was not Assyrian. She talked endearingly about what her younger self aspired to be when she grew up. Smiling, she shared, I wanted to study, be something for myself, like be a nurse. These kinds of things my heart really desired, just to put a hat on how they put the cute hats on in the hospital. It is such a shame that we were not able to go to school for that. My dad would say, her mind is so good that she could have become a lawyer. And I would say, I won't study at home. I only wanted school. In Nana John's case, the choice not to fulfill her own aspirations was not her own, but rather one made for her. So this also goes back to the earlier discussion of Assyrian women feeling a much higher pressure and having much greater consequences for marrying someone that is not Assyrian. And so the past two examples have shown Assyrian women placing their families or their communities' needs above their own desires, either willingly or not. But all women also described victories and goals they had accomplished throughout their lives in Iran and the US. For some, it was academic, like finishing a degree or beauty school. For others, it was learning how to drive and getting a job. While each woman had a story to tell about her accomplishments, there was a consensus that working towards these goals was only possible if it did not interfere with meeting one's family and community obligations. This was often incredibly difficult. In Katie's interview, she detailed several instances in her life when she was committed to fulfilling her goals and desires and did. Achieving these as both a recent immigrant and an Assyrian mom, Katie emphasized was not easy. Describing how thin she was spread between working, supporting her family, and making progress towards her goals, Katie shared, I can't believe it. A person who came to this country not knowing the language and all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, excuse me, I take that back. It was not all of a sudden. It took me a long road. And that long road had a lot of ups and downs. Sometimes, like till 2 o'clock in the morning, I was sitting and I was doing my homework, and on the side, I was cooking for my morning family life. Katie went on to describe how she is very proud of herself and what she has accomplished, sharing that it is not easy for a woman to immigrate as an adult to a new country and not only learn the dominant language fluently, but also work outside the home and graduate from university, all while raising two children. And this brings us to the fourth finding, which is that in the face of external barriers and challenges, Assyrian women emphasize their own autonomy and power. And so when I asked Katie, what is a common struggle Assyrian women have? This was her response. She shared, when the regime changed, the women became not to say productive, but the country not wanting them to be productive. So they didn't mix them with everything and everywhere. So women were just housemakers. And then later on, as you grow and as life goes on, women notice that no, we are a huge key to the world. And she shared that I tell my kids always, and I tell every woman that is not that powerful or they're weak or naive. I tell them, if I could do it, you can do it. And I tell my kids, if I could do it with having two of you in my hand, raising you, and first I paid attention to your education, not my education, then you can do it. When I asked the women how they could be better supported or what was a common struggle for Assyrian women, most of the women, rather than list things like support at home or support from the community, talked about the importance of inner strength and commitment. If you know Assyrian moms, this probably makes sense as you will rarely hear them asking for help. Assyrian moms take on a lot, and so when the question is posed of what could better help them, it's as if there's no better answer than they themselves. And so in Michelle's interview, the topic came up of what Assyrian women who cannot read or write, such as herself, can do to pass on their language and culture to their children. Michelle shelled whatever is in their power, whatever they can do something. Perhaps they cannot teach a lot of things, but they can still teach some things, like cook this thing, cook bushalak, dolma, things like this. It's everything, housekeeping, child rearing, and more. Everything. Michelle's perspective highlights both that the Assyrian identity and really Assyrian motherwork encompasses much more than just passing on the Assyrian language. And two, Michelle shows that teaching practical skills like cooking traditional dishes is just as important to preserving the Assyrian heritage as teaching literacy. In this way, Michelle finds ways in her power to pass on the Assyrian identity to her kids, even if that doesn't directly involve things like reading and writing. And so now I want to revisit my research question and kind of talk about all of those the information that the women shared and the narratives they shared. The research question for this thesis was, what are the sociolinguistic experiences of immigrant Assyrian women, and how do these experiences shape their identity? And so each narrative was unique, yet all six reflected a deep-rooted sense of responsibility to keep the Assyrian identity and language alive. And so Assyrian women described empowering and serving their communities as educators, keepers of culture, community builders, transmitters of language and heritage. And these were in ways that were more visible, like placing and helping their children in Assyrian classes and spending time one-on-one working and teaching them the Assyrian language and culture, but also in less visible ways, like strictly marrying within the community with the idea that if both parents can speak Assyrian, their child and future generations will be more likely to as well. Also, the challenges the women described were heavy, and this ranged from carrying the weight of ensuring the survival of their culture and language to balancing family needs, employment obligations, and one's own aspirations. Yes, they found empowerment in motherhood, but they also struggled a lot with the unequal distribution of labor within the home that many Assyrian women face. And then, in response to these challenges, the women described being their own support system and having a strong sense of inner strength. And so, some recommendations for action and further study. So, one of the points many of the Assyrian women talked about is the value in and the impact of Assyrian community organizations and schooling, which is less abundant in the US as compared to Iran. And as such, one recommendation for action to not just support Assyrian women, but the Assyrian community as a whole is to invest in and expand Assyrian language education at the local level. Specifically, cities with high populations of Assyrians like Turlock can collaborate with Assyrian community leaders and organizations to allocate educational resources specifically aimed at supporting Assyrian language schooling. And although this likely will not change the notion of what is expected of Assyrian women, by prioritizing the Assyrian language education at the local level, Assyrian women at the very least have better community resources and avenues to seek support. And that was my thesis. I ran through it kind of fast. It looks like we're a little early, but
No,
yeah.
thank you, Paige. Thank you for your presentation. And, especially sharing your research, this important research, and highlighting the important roles of Assyrian women and they take on as mothers, and also showcasing their aspirations, not only for themselves, but for their children. Um, I think your findings were something that all women from different cultural backgrounds can at some point relate to,
Yeah.
either themselves or maybe they, their mothers have the same experiences or their aunts or their grandmothers. But I thought this presentation is really thought provoking. And when it comes to show how community can actually help alleviate women's struggles, I think that was also a very important aspect that you highlighted as well towards the end. So right now we will transition and move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you haven't submitted your questions, now is the time to do so. We do have a few that have been submitted, so we'll go ahead and take them by order that came in. Let's see. So the first question is, what was the most rewarding aspect of doing all of this research and meeting the Assyrian women in person?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that the most rewarding aspect of this research was really giving the women, like having time for the women just to share in their own experience and their own perspectives. I think a lot of the time, Assyrian women's perspectives, particularly older Assyrian women's, their kind of experiences kind of get swept under the rug, and they're so busy doing so much else in their life that we don't really get to take time to just hear about their background and their stories. And so for me, it was really rewarding to just be able to sit down and hear these stories. Yeah.
Okay, and then there's another question. What made you consider only Assyrian women relative to comparing different ethnic minorities in your research?
That's a great question. Can you read it? Can you say it one more time?
What made you consider only Assyrian women relative to comparing different ethnic minorities in your research? So I guess, yes, why did you just only focus on Assyrian women versus focusing on maybe other ethnic minorities,
Yeah.
like maybe Afghanis, so on and so
Yeah.
forth?
Yeah, I think because I'm from Turlock, I had easier access to the Assyrian community, and also I wanted to work with the community that was a linguistic minority. Um, it seems like I speak Spanish fluently too, and yet I chose not to work with people in the Latino community because I felt like in terms of linguistic minority, Assyrians are have a much longer history of being a linguistic minority. And so I knew that I wanted to work with that population. Also, I knew that there was very little research on the Assyrian community. And when I was doing the literature review, I had a really hard time finding any resources or at least research really on Assyrian women versus a lot of my literature review is filled with research on other immigrant communities. I have a lot on different Latino communities. I have some about like Zapoteca mothers. I have some on Afghani mothers too. But for Assyrian women, there was just nothing. And so that was kind of my reason for doing that.
It was a true gap in the literature.
Yeah,
Took
yeah,
the opportunity. I mean, that's really good to hear. I mean, not good to hear that there is a gap, but I mean, it's good to know that you saw that and you ran with it and you wanted to highlight Assyrian women and focus on them because of this huge gap in the
yeah.
academic literature.
And
Um,
and I think it's so important for people to do research with immigrant women and immigrant mothers specifically. And that's not to say that I don't mean to say that you shouldn't, these other immigrant communities don't need research being done on them because they do very much so. It's just that for me, in what I was able to do, I felt like the biggest need was for Assyrian women's narratives to be documented.
okay, so more questions are coming in. This is good. So are you considering expanding your research, or I guess it's already to be published, I assume your master's thesis soon
Mhm.
to be So are you considering expanding this particular research to conduct interviews with maybe other Assyrian women from different diaspora communities, maybe outside of California, maybe in Arizona or in Michigan, to see if they share any similarities or differences with your current findings?
Yeah, and so this was one of the big limitations in my work was that I had a very small sample size of just 6 women, and I tried my very best to get a diverse group of 6 women who came, some in the 90s, some in the late 2010s. Like I tried to get it as varied as I could, but because it was a master's thesis and not a PhD dissertation, the time and the resources I had were very limited. Master's thesis, at least in my program, like you don't get funding and you're kind of on your own doing it. And also you only have 1 semester to prep for it and then 1 semester to actually write it. And so I had at the start of that year, I had such big aspirations and I wanted to do so much. And then when you really get down to it, it's like, okay, I realistically only am going to be able to do a small handful of interviews in the time I have. So in the future, yes, I would love to get a broader sample as opposed to 6 women, 30 women and maybe women from Chicago, Arizona, Iraqi Assyrian immigrants and Syrian Assyrian immigrants or Syrian Assyrian American immigrants. Um, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that would be really great research. I think it would be something where not only Assyrians in general would be interested to learn about, but potentially that opens up the door for other scholars, maybe in linguistics, but also in political science, history, to also do a comparative analysis between the different
Yeah.
types of ethnic minorities. Okay, that's just my political science brain. Went into it. So I find it interesting that it was mentioned that Assyrian women can only achieve their own goals if it does not take away from their role of mothering. What are some ways to seek support, especially because Assyrian women do not often ask for help?
Yeah, I see that question too. I want to read it one more time. Even to not take away from the role of mothering, what are some ways to seek support, especially because Syrian women do not often ask for help? Um, that's a great question. And I think when I was asking the women, like, how do you think Assyrian women could better seek support, or how do you think they could be better supported? Like, a lot of the women themselves didn't really have an idea. They were just like, oh, I just need to be stronger, or oh, I just need to, like, try harder. And it's like this question of how can you, better support Assyrian mothers when there's really like not a perfect avenue for that. My recommendation is for there to be a bigger community effort to support Assyrians, and that looking like, schooling and Assyrian classes and more of a community effort to help Assyrian mothers, or not even Assyrian mothers, just the Assyrian community and Assyrian children learn Assyrian and learn the Assyrian heritage. Because if not, it often just ends up being placed on the mothers to do it.
So thank you for sharing your research with us. My question is, are you considering expanding your research to conduct interviews? Oh, okay, sorry, this was already answered. So after completing your research, would you have added or adjusted that you did not think at the time? I
After
guess,
completed, what would
do you
you
have,
have?
yeah, added or adjusted, I guess, maybe questions, I'm assuming they're asking.
Yeah. Oh, okay. After what would you? Um, if I had more time, I think that I would have added more participants. I originally wanted to do 15 participants, and just given that each interview took 1 to 3 hours, and that's just like the interview itself. It wasn't also the transcribing and all of that. And using the software, it takes a long time. And then for my like the people helping me do the translation and the translating, like it took an even longer time because you have 1 to 3 hours of an interview, and you have to not only type the whole thing by hand but translate it all by hand. And they were doing this, like they were volunteering to do this wasn't like something that the my master's program helped me compensate them for. And so if I had more resources and more time, like maybe doing a PhD dissertation, it would definitely be that, like expanding my sample size. That would probably be the biggest thing I would want to do differently.
Mhm. So are you able to discuss any geographical patterns, how these women ended up in Turlock, and did this setting significantly affect any of their experiences?
Yeah, and so kind of this talks about like the history of Assyrians and Turlock. For the women specifically that I interviewed, it was kind of two different waves of immigration. One was post-regime change in Iran when that was when mostly the women that were living near the capital immigrated. They left Iran because of the regime change, came to the US seeking a better life and more freedoms. And then the second pattern of immigration was closer to the like 2010s. Um, there was a difference in the kind of the answers to questions from those two different immigration patterns. I think it's not necessarily clear if it's because of the year in which they immigrated or if it's because the cities in which they lived. For example, women who live near the capital, Tehran, were often had higher education versus the women who lived in the Urmi villages or outside of Urmi. They usually tended to not have as high of access to education. And so because of that, kind of their perspectives on things were a little different. I also think that the women who immigrated earlier had a longer period of time here to learn English. And so their thoughts were also a little different on things, given that they were able to communicate in English and able to access more services and more resources in their community versus women who immigrated in like let's say like the 2010s. They didn't have as high of access to these services and education that United States has.
So I guess this is very related to what you were talking about, Assyrian women who are educated. Did you consider interviewing educated Assyrian women in the area, or maybe outside of Turlock a little bit, like maybe in Modesto or San Jose or other areas where Assyrians are populated, maybe to compare to the Assyrian women who lack the education? So I guess like a cross comparison analysis.
Yeah, so the women I interviewed, there was a range of educational backgrounds. We had women who had like very little education, like highest was like third grade, and some with no formal education, all the way to, there were women who did finish high school and women who did finish like degrees and women who did go to beauty school. And, there was just kind of a range of educational experiences. In my thesis, I didn't compare necessarily their experiences. I kind of just focused on finding similarities in them. But this goes back to the question of like, what would I do differently? I do think there's something to say about comparing the perspectives of women, Assyrian women, based on like education levels. But to answer your question, I didn't necessarily compare that in my thesis.
Okay. And in your findings, have any of the women you interviewed discussed any mental health challenges related to immigration, or maybe just adjusting to new society and adjusting to their role as being a mother and taking care of their kids in the new area where they immigrated to?
Yeah, I didn't touch on this in this presentation, but a huge topic in my thesis too was the guilt that a lot of Assyrian American women feel. I think I know because Assyrian women have a lot on their plate when it comes to raising Assyrian children and the expectation of them to have perfectly fluent Assyrian kids is very hard when you're working full time, as many Assyrian American women are, just you have to in this economy. And so a lot of the women in terms of mental health describe just feeling a lot of guilt when their child wasn't able to speak Assyrian fluently or struggled with speaking Assyrian. And the reason for that is not even necessarily a reflection on them as a mother, but it's much harder for a kid to learn Assyrian in the United States context. In Iran, like there's a very strict sentiment of Farsi not being spoken in the home, and there's this sort of resistance to that. But in the United States, where there's not really like a resistance to English, or a sentiment that you shouldn't learn English, it's much harder to convince your child to only speak Assyrian in the house. and especially because of how English is culturally in media and in school and it's everywhere. It's very hard to kind of keep that strict policy almost of only speaking Assyrian in the house and only, communicating with others in Assyrian.
Yeah, it's very true. I take to that sentiment about, it being English being more acceptable in the households than Farsi is for those Assyrian women or Assyrian families in Iran. And it makes it difficult for the first generation for them to sometimes keep Assyrian language and practice it, especially because the assimilations are so different. In the United States, assimilation is very quick, and you know, most Assyrians would agree with this, where it's yes, it's easy to learn Assyrian, but to keep it is quite difficult, especially going into schools and going to high schools and higher education where English is very prevalent. And but so it's a struggle, is what I'm saying. It's like you have to practice it and make sure you keep it so that it's in your life versus being in other parts of the world, especially in the Middle Eastern countries where you're not always assimilated so easily into the culture and you feel like an outsider. And so you want to practice your culture and make sure it's very active and live through the language. So we have one more question before we kind of close off. I make sure I give Paige the last word as well. But what is some of the future work that remains as part of your study, or maybe even part of future researches? What areas would you like to explore or feel that needs to be explored or highlighted?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that in future work, it would be really rewarding and really interesting. Just as I interviewed, Assyrian moms who immigrated as adults to interview Assyrian dads and how they feel on these topics of immigration and language education and passing on the Assyrian identity. Just as there was a lack of research on Assyrian women, there also lacked research on Assyrian men. I just chose to do mine on Assyrian moms, but there's very much still a need on research with Assyrian dads. And also not even just moms and dads, but researching Assyrian, youth and their experience with Assyrian language education and their, even a comparative difference, comparing the difference in, Assyrian youth in countries like Iran and Iraq versus, Assyrian youth in the US and their language practices. Like there's so much research that can be done with the Assyrian community, and this was just a small drop in a pool of that, and it was really rewarding to be able to at least contribute something.
Yeah, I mean, I think your research is definitely something very thought-provoking, like I mentioned earlier, and really needed for the academic community. So right now we reached the end of the webinar. So before you go, I would like to first thank Paige and also everyone here today for joining this webinar. And Paige, your research and your findings you shared with us have been incredibly enlightening and very inspiring, and I hope inspires future scholars either right now or in the future to conduct research on Assyrians. I know that on behalf of Assyrian Studies Society, we are grateful for the valuable insights that you provided, and we're confident that our attendees have gained a deeper understanding and new perspectives that will greatly benefit their own academic and maybe even professional journeys, or maybe just they're interested in attending this. So we thank them and we thank you for this presentation. And we hope all of you found this webinar helpful, and we hope to see you at our next event. Paige, I want to give the last word to you before we sign off.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for having me, Alexandra, and thank you to the Assyrian Studies Association for giving me the opportunity to share my research today. And thank you for all attending today. I also would feel terrible if I didn't say thank you to the women who participated in this research. This research would not have been possible without them, and I'm indebted to them for all that they gave to this. Also, thank you to the translators and transcribers and interpreters I had, Kevin and Sarah. You guys were instrumental in this research. And yeah, I'm very excited for all that there is to come with Assyrian research and all the great work that Assyrian Studies Association is doing.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We hope to see you again in the future.